Good evening. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Our first speaker this evening is Dr. William Short. Brother Bill is a Franciscan friar of the St. Barbara province. He's a professor of Christian spirituality at the Franciscan School of Theology and director of the Collegium Bonaventure International Center for Franciscan Studies and Research in Rome. Born in Seattle, Washington, he received his doctorate from the Pontifical Gregorian University. He collaborated with Wayne Hellman, a Franciscan conventual, and Regis Armstrong, a Capuchin, in publishing the 3-volume series, Francis of Assisi Early Documents. His talk is entitled, Reimaging the Image of God. And after his talk, we will have a response from Dr. Michael Blastic. Father Mike is a Franciscan friar of the Holy Name of Jesus province. He's been here at FST for about a year and a half, and he serves as the Distinguished Visiting Professor of Franciscan Spirituality and History. Please welcome Brother Bill.
Thank you very much, Juliet. Thanks to all of you for being here this evening. It's my pleasure to address a topic that is dear to my heart, and I hope one that will be of interest to you. Reimagining the image of God, from the human to the cosmos. And it begins with images of two faces, Pope Francis and Saint Francis. On March 16th, 2013, the newly elected Jesuit Pope from Argentina held his first press conference and was asked why he had chosen the name Francis. His answer surprised them. Some people wanted to know why the Bishop of Rome wished to be called Francis. Some thought of Francis Xavier, others of Francis de Sales, or also Francis of Assisi. I will tell you the story. During the election, I was seated next to the Archbishop Emeritus of Sao Paulo, Brazil, Prefect Emeritus of the Congregation for the Clergy, Cardinal Claudio Humez. I would add, a Franciscan. A good friend. When things were looking dangerous, he encouraged me, and when the votes reached 2/3, there was the usual applause because the Pope had been elected. And he gave me a hug and a kiss and said, "Don't forget the poor." And those words came to me, the poor, the poor. Then right away, thinking of the poor, I thought of Francis of Assisi. Then I thought of all the wars as the votes were still being counted till the end. Francis is also the man of peace. That is how the name came into my heart, Francis of Assisi. For me, he is the man of poverty, the man of peace, the man who loves and protects creation. These days, we do not have a very good relationship with creation, do we? He is the man who gives us this spirit of peace, the poor man. How I would like a church which is poor and for the poor. Those remarks, jumbling together aspects of the career and the charism of Francis of Assisi, also echoed something else. That expression about a poor church could seem at first like a casual, off-the-cuff remark at a press conference. But in fact, that was a very deliberate choice. It was a theme discussed, controversial, at the Second Vatican Council. Saint Pope John the 23rd gave a television address 1 month before the opening of the Second Vatican Council on September the 11th, 1962. Here he is at that address. He spoke with great conviction of the presence of the Church in the world's poorest countries as the Church of all, and especially the Church of the poor. He continued by insisting on a just distribution of created goods for the advantage of all, remarking that such an approach is innate to true Christianity, and that this is a practice to be energetically put into action. For the next few months, the members of the Second Vatican Council, the bishops, discussed their understanding of the Church. They began to produce the very first documents of that important council, and they ended the first session of their deliberations, that is, the first period of the council, in December of 1962. And at that conclusion of part one, Cardinal Giuseppe Lercaro of Bologna took the podium to re-emphasize that theme of the poor church in these words. This is the hour of the poor, of the millions of poor throughout the earth. This is the hour of the mystery of the Mother Church of the poor. This is the hour of the mystery of Christ above all in the poor. What I mean is that the mystery of Christ in the church has always been, but today even more so, the mystery of Christ in the poor. Inasmuch as the church, as the Holy Father John the 23rd has said, is indeed the church of all, today it is especially the church of the poor. So that phrase, the church of the poor, was not simply an offhand, casual remark at a press conference. It was a remark that came with a history, because that phrase did not survive the votes on the council's text on the church. And it might easily have been forgotten. But someone remembered that phrase and its meaning. To the surprise of many, that same phrase reappeared forcefully some 50 years later in that March press conference of 2013 of a newly elected pope from Latin America. The title of a recent work by Clemens Sedma, I think you can see it there, from the Keough School of Global Studies, Global Affairs at Notre Dame, encapsulates, I think, both in its title and its images, this subtitle, which is a little difficult to read, Pope Francis and the Transformation of Orthodoxy. It is as if our way of understanding the church changes when we look at it from the point of view of the poor. When we look at the person of Christ through the eyes of the poor, as one of the poor. When we look at the mystery of God as a God who is poor, this re-imaging of God from the standpoint of the poor is something that has also been concretized in the ministry and the actions of our new Pope. Early in his ministry as Bishop of Rome, Pope Francis made visible and tangible what he means when he talks about a poor church and a church for the poor. He chose to make his first pastoral visit outside Rome to the refugee camps, those on the tiny Italian island of Lampedusa, situated between the coast of Sicily and the coast of Libya. It had become, in a short time, a teeming shelter for refugees crossing the Mediterranean. There he met hundreds of migrants who had survived days at sea in flimsy boats in order to reach the safety of that island, though many drowned in the attempt, fleeing the violence of their home countries in the Horn of Africa. The Pope has a special understanding of the plight of refugees. He's the son of migrants who had to flee from their home in the Piemonte region of northern Italy to escape the rise of violent fascism under Benito Mussolini. They found a new home in the working class neighborhood, the Porteño neighborhood of Buenos Aires, Argentina. And that's where young Jorge Bergoglio was born. Standing among the migrants in Lampedusa, this son of migrants from Argentina called on Italy, Europe, and global society to a reawakening of conscience, as he said, in order to counter what he described as the global indifference to migrants. He described it in this way: we have lost a sense of brotherly responsibility, recalling that indifference of many confronted by the reality of thousands of brothers and sisters who lose their lives each year in the attempt to migrate to a safer place. He noted with sadness, we have forgotten how to cry. His visits to migrants and refugees have been repeated in visits to many other countries over the course of the last 10 years. Here is one of the reasons for choosing his new name as Pope. Right away, thinking of the poor, I thought of Francis of Assisi. And if we turn to words actually written by St. Francis in the 9th chapter of his early rule, we find a good description of what he thought a church of the poor looks like. He tells his brothers and sisters, we must rejoice when we live among people considered of little value and looked down upon, among the poor and the powerless, the sick and the lepers, and the beggars by the wayside. Let us not be ashamed. Remember, moreover, that our Lord Jesus Christ was poor and a stranger and lived on alms, he, the Blessed Virgin, and his disciples. This image by the French artist Philippe de Champaigne depicts the flight into Egypt. I apologize to art historians here. It seems that the image has actually been reversed left to right, but it's still a wonderful representation of this perilous journey. We may say that the artist is reimagining the image of God in his own world of Paris in the mid-17th century with its colors and its clothing. But we see the most important figures: the Son of God, the Word made flesh, as the helpless newborn Jesus, resting in the arms of a barefoot mother as she rides a donkey, with her husband Joseph leading them as guide and protector on the dangerous journey to a foreign land. He has a wooden staff in his hand and an improvised backpack with a bedroll. They're just at the point of crossing by stepping stones over a river. Perhaps we're to think of the Nile. The artist presumes that we know the story that is portrayed here, the reason for this hard journey to Egypt. This family is fleeing violence. The violence of a despotic ruler named Herod, who has ordered the murder of children in the town of Bethlehem in order to protect his own grip on power. The family were only there temporarily in the town because of a census, and even there had not been able to find a place to stay, despite the advanced pregnancy of the young mother. Now, with a baby to care for, they find themselves homeless in Judea and threatened as well, so they flee toward the relative safety of Egypt, guided only by a dream that Joseph had. This image, the poor migrant Christ, portrays in line and color what a church of the poor might look like. 2 or 3 gathered in his name, on the way, depending for their survival on the hospitality of others. Here is the body of Christ, held by a poor woman, led by an unemployed carpenter with a small donkey for a throne. This provides an example of the theme of this conference, reimagining the world. In this case, it also means reimagining God's presence among us, reimagining the church as poor, modeled on Christ, its head, who is poor. Like Pope Francis on the tiny island of Lampedusa, or like us at U.S. border crossings with Mexico within the Diocese of San Diego, to reimagine this church of the poor and for the poor means being a community of faith that welcomes the immigrant, the refugee. Our local church in San Diego lives and serves and prays in a society on the border, with a river to cross along much of its length, with the flight into Egypt reenacted here every day by many families. But another way to be the poor church is to choose the role of the servant. to model a society in which the last are first and the least are considered the greatest. What we celebrate in the liturgy of Holy Thursday, in the washing of the feet, is just such a concrete action of service that marks the Church of the Poor. For this is the sign that Jesus chose, to reveal to his followers his true and full identity as the Son of God, as he was about to suffer and die. When we, like Pope Francis pictured here, reenact this gesture in the liturgy, we do so also mindful that we reenact it also in daily gestures of caring for others. Whether parents with their children, younger family members with their elders, healthcare providers with their patients, and many more day-to-day examples. Such actions were repeated frequently by St. Francis in his long years of serving people infected with Hansen's disease or leprosy, even at the risk of contracting the disease himself. The simple task of washing someone is a very concrete and intimate example of solidarity, care, and welcome to those who are otherwise feared and shunned by their society. A church of the poor welcomes those who are otherwise unwelcome, following the example of Jesus, who is friend of the sick and the sinner, the tax collector, and even friend to the one who would betray him. We're meeting this evening in the beautiful home of the Joan B. Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice. Its programs, especially its cross-border initiatives, express the University of San Diego's commitment to enflesh Catholic social teaching on issues of immigration and border violence, while building strong bonds of trust and solidarity with our neighbors in Tijuana and all along our border with Mexico. Many of you had the opportunity to spend the earlier part of this day in an immersion experience at the border. And you know firsthand the difficult and effective work of so many people on both sides of the border who try to incarnate that invitation that we hear also from Pope Francis to show responsibility for our brothers and sisters, or simply knowing how to cry for the many who lose their lives every day attempting to cross borders around the world. Each of you becomes the face of this church for the poor when you generously put yourself into the midst of the suffering and the hope of others. We have been challenged by Pope Francis also to think about reimagining our social relationships. We know that Francis of Assisi liked to address people, and not only people, as brother and sister. He was trying to reimagine social relationships within the very strict hierarchies of his own medieval culture. As his guide, as always, he turned to the words and the actions of Jesus in the gospel. In this case, to chapter 23 of Matthew's gospel, where there's quite a discussion about titles and positions, and how Jesus prefers a language that is more suited to siblings of the same family, rather than a language of parents or teachers. As we know from the familiar verses, do not be called rabbi. You have but one teacher, and you are all brothers. Call no one on earth your father. You have but one Father in heaven. Do not be called master. You have but one master, the Messiah. The greatest among you must be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but whoever humbles himself will be exalted. That phrase, you are all brothers, to recognize that we belong to the same family, that every human being is brother or sister to us. This is a vision of humanity that was controversial in the Middle Ages, and I think is still so today. It's not surprising that the title that Pope Francis chose for his recent social encyclical underlines that phrase from the gospel that meant so much to St. Francis. Fratelli tutti, all brothers and sisters. And I think it's very appropriate that at least one publisher chose the image that we see here for this encyclical, the Good Samaritan. The well-known parable from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, tells us about a despised foreigner, someone who practices the wrong kind of religion, someone who unexpectedly becomes the neighbor to a victim of violence, the one who treats his wounds and pays the expenses for his recovery. The subtitle of the encyclical speaks of fraternity and social friendship. We could say that it is about what it means to become a neighbor to the other. This encyclical proposes a goal of social harmony among the inhabitants of this earth that complements a harmony with the broader world of creation itself, the environment that sustains us all. It includes concrete initiatives for peacemaking between enemies and practices of reconciliation and solidarity. I think we all know that St. Francis is popularly associated with a prayer. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. It's also a popular hymn. We do not find the text of that prayer exactly among the writings we have from Francis, but it represents, I think, pretty well a dimension of his mission and that of his followers, their initiatives for peacemaking. Now, in the 13th century, the conflicts and the violence in society raging between opposing groups, they called themselves the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, basically supporters of the Roman Pope or of the German Holy Roman Emperor. Both church and society were deeply polarized by these divisions between the two parties, to the point of violence. Hundreds died in internal civil conflict caused by that polarization. These were wars between rival cities in Europe that pitted Christian against Christian in bloody battles for domination of land and resources. Francis himself, as a young man, had fought in just such a war between his native Assisi and its neighboring enemy town of Perugia. But in an important battle Assisi was defeated. He was captured, taken as a prisoner of war. In later years, the saint would preach passionately in an attempt to stop these civil conflicts in Italian towns, though very often without success. But conflict in his day was also fueled by differences of religious belief. Christians and Muslims in particular had been involved in holy wars for more than 200 years. To think of peaceful relationships between them was unimaginable. To a greater or lesser degree, that hostility ebbed and flowed over the intervening centuries until quite recently. In 2019, as we see here, Pope Francis and the Grand Imam of the Al-Azhar Mosque of Cairo, Ahmet Al-Tayeb, signed a document entitled Human Fraternity for World Peace and Living Together. A moment from that meeting is captured in this photograph that I think conveys graphically a sense of warm friendship. That cordial meeting between the preeminent religious authority of Sunni Islam and the Bishop of Rome, in fact, builds on a series of earlier initiatives in this direction by previous popes. These, too, were inspired by the example of St. Francis. Saint Pope John XXIII was a member of the Franciscan Third Order, or the secular Franciscan Order. During his years as papal nuncio in Turkey, he had given an example, more than a speech, an ongoing example of peaceful hospitality and cordiality, living in Istanbul as part of a small Christian minority within a secularizing Muslim majority under the government of Ataturk. And years later, celebrating the memory of St. Francis, St. John Paul II convoked a meeting of the leaders of world religions in Assisi in January of 2002. Their purpose was to pray for peace and to offer to the world the striking image of figures from many different religions, united in a common purpose, to show that the world's religions can be instruments of peace rather than sources of violence. That outlook did not mark the church in the 13th century. During his lifetime, St. Francis saw the launching of the Fifth Crusade, as the armies of Christian Europe battled the forces of the Islamic government of the Near East over control of Jerusalem and other places where Christ had lived and taught the gospel of peace. Christians called their Muslim opponents enemies of the cross of Christ, while the Muslims simply called the Christians infidels. All churches of Christendom were required to add at the conclusion of the liturgy of the Eucharist the prayer for the success of this crusade. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. At the height of the Christian siege of the Egyptian Muslim stronghold of Damietta in Egypt, Brother Francis of Assisi walked barefoot, unarmed, across the no man's land, dividing the Christian from the Muslim army, in order to meet in peace with the Muslim commander, the Kurdish Sultan from modern-day Iraq, Malek el-Khamil. Much to the surprise of the Christian chroniclers of the crusade, the Sultan listened to the little barefoot Italian man and treated him kindly, even offered him gifts, We do not know the content of their conversations. But on his return to the Christian camp, the saint made repeated pleas to Christian commanders to accept the offer of peace already proposed by the Sultan. But he met with nothing but resistance. They stubbornly pursued their planned attack until they suffered a disastrous defeat at the hands of the Muslim forces, resulting in a horrifying slaughter of the Crusaders witnessed by Francis himself. In that first press conference 10 years ago, Pope Francis portrayed his new patron in this light as one who knew the reality of violence and its consequences. As he said, "I thought of all the wars, and Francis is the man of peace." Some dramatic gestures over the last 10 years of his ministry as Bishop of Rome have shown that saint from Assisi continues to inspire him in what he says and in what he does. But for our purposes this evening, we should say that we do not need to travel to Egypt or to Rome or Assisi in order to see fruitful initiatives for peacemaking. They can be found much closer to home. Here at USD, we're enjoying the hospitality of the Kroc Center, which is the home of the School of Peace Studies. It supports such innovative programs as the Women Peacemakers Fellowship to strengthen international networks of those building peace in their home countries, sharing their experience as an example for others committed to peacemaking in their own lands. Even the works of art that we can imagine, that we can admire around the grounds of this campus speak of its mission of peace building. Perhaps you've already noticed that the Saint of Peace, the inspiration to our Pope, is also very near to us here this evening. Just behind this building, there's a simple but beautiful reflecting pool and the beautiful Garden of the Sea, a viewpoint that I recommend you visit, overlooking Mission Bay and the Pacific Ocean beyond. Just to one side, on your right as you're facing the ocean, unobtrusive, you will spy a spare, almost minimalist statue of St. Francis, crafted by the Italian-born San Francisco sculptor and pacifist Beniamino Buffano, Benny to his friends. In his works, he frequently celebrated the figure of St. Francis, who was the patron of his adopted home of San Francisco, and for him, the great example of peacemaking for our own times. The need for peacemaking remains urgent. We witness the plague of violence in repeated mass shootings in our own country. We see violence abroad every evening on the news, most dramatically the appalling loss of human lives in Ukraine. In April of last year, Pope Francis received an unusual gift, a dirty and stained Ukrainian flag, which he displayed to the thousands of pilgrims who had gathered for his weekly general audience. He kissed that tattered flag and explained to the pilgrims in the audience hall, "It came to me yesterday, on Tuesday, from the war, precisely from the martyred city of Bucha signed by the survivors. The horrific slaughter of that Ukrainian city's population tragically mirrors the kind of violence and destruction that St. Francis had tried to stop in his native Italy and in his visit to Egypt. I was educated by Jesuits, taken hostage by Franciscans, refused by the Dominicans. But I would like to quote from a Jesuit whom I admire very much. His name is Patrick Ryan. He's the McGinley Professor of Religion and Society at Fordham in New York and was the founding president of Loyola Jesuit College in Abuja in Nigeria. He wrote these words for America magazine shortly after the 9/11 attacks of 2001. He says, St. Francis of Assisi walked through the Crusader battle lines near Damietta in 1219, entering the presence of that Kurdish ruler of Egypt, Al-Malik el-Kamil. The Sultan, son of the famous Salah al-Din, or Saladin, was impressed by the piety and simplicity of the poor man and allowed him to return in peace to his fellow Christians. But the later career of Al-Malik el-Kamil also featured a surprising détente with the Frankish invaders of the Muslim Middle East. He even returned Jerusalem to Christian control. It is said he gave to the Franciscans the custody of the Christian holy places. We need a new St. Francis today, but we may also need a new Al-Malik al-Kamil. A church of the poor, reimagining social relationships as brothers and sisters, promoting social harmony and peacemaking. These initiatives, reflected in the encyclicals of Pope Francis, are complemented certainly by Laudato Si, his great message on care for creation. Remember that remark at the opening of his press conference when he spoke about the inspiring figures of his life. A few days later, on March 19th, the feast of St. Joseph, he actually was officially installed as Bishop of Rome. And he used the occasion of the feast day to talk about Joseph as the figure of the protector. He said, "Let us protect Christ in our lives so that we can protect others, so that we can protect creation." The vocation of being a protector, however, is not just something involving us, Christians, alone. It has a prior dimension, which is simply human, involving everyone. It means protecting all creation, the beauty of the created world, as the book of Genesis tells us, and as St. Francis of Assisi shows us. In the end, everything has been entrusted to our protection. All of us are responsible for it. Be protectors of God's gifts. Such a view presumes God's presence within the created order, and it is that view that lies behind some of the poetry of St. Francis. In his famous Canticle of the Creatures, or the Canticle of Brother Sun, it was composed at a time of serious illness when Francis was actually losing his eyesight, toward the end of his life. But he wrote exuberantly of a world marked by a kinship that is left mysteriously unexplained. Laudato sii mi Signore, con tutte le tue creature, specialmente messer lo frate sole. Praise be you, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially Sir, brother, sun, who is the day, through whom you give us light. He is beautiful and radiant with great splendor and bears a likeness of you, Most High One. That opening phrase, praised be you, in Italian, laudato si, is that title of the encyclical on care for our common home. One of the reasons for choosing the name Francis is that aspect of the saint's life as one who loves and protects creation. And the Pope's remark that these days we don't have a very good relationship with creation, do we? Francis of Assisi continues his canticle. Laudato si mi Signore per sora luna e le stelle. Praise be you, my Lord, through sister moon and the stars. In heaven you formed them, clear and precious and beautiful. But we might ask, how is it that an Italian religious troubadour can sing of the inanimate sun as his brother, or as bearing the likeness of God, or moon and stars as clear and precious with the name of sister? It might seem maybe they just all have a common source, a common creator. But if we look a little bit further, it seems that they are all related to a common sibling, an elder brother who is the firstborn of all creation. All human beings and all creatures of the universe are brother and sister to each other because of their shared bond to Christ, through whom and for whom they all exist. At this point, we're actually talking about moving from the cosmos to the human in a kind of Franciscan vision that reimagines how the world operates. One of our great challenges as Christians today is to offer a comprehensive theological vision that makes the connections of God to creation, human being to human being, and to the created world around us, within the seemingly unlimited expanse of an expanding cosmos observed by the finite, mortal human person. Inspired by biblical texts, the Franciscan tradition of thought over the centuries has expanded original insights from St. Francis. The celebration of Christ in the letter to the Colossians, chapter 1, has been an important point of reference. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things, in heaven and on earth, were created, things visible and invisible, thrones, dominions, rulers, powers. All things have been created through him and for him. He's the head of the body, the church. He's the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. If we build on that vision of everything in the universe, visible and invisible, centered on Christ, it even puts our humanity in a different light. The sin of our first parents original sin, and human evil are not the center of the story of creation. Let's get over ourselves. The person of Christ is at the center. The love of God is at the center of the story. Love who comes in the form of a baby who has the first place in everything. The prologue of St. John's Gospel also speaks to us about the importance of this incarnate event. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. What would that mean for the way that we look at the world, from subatomic particles to those Hubble snapshots of our expanding universe? How can this way of understanding the role of Christ help us to reimagine the very universe in which we exist? It puts human beings, first of all, in our proper context. We are part of a much bigger reality that embraces more than we can see or even guess. This vast universe in which we inhabit a tiny place has significance for believers because all things exist for Christ and in him, and without him, nothing would exist. It offers an unexpected answer to a persistent question. Why is there something and not nothing? And the answer for Francis is because of Christ. Following this line of thought, every particle, every planet, every person exists in Christ. And because of Christ, it means the created world has meaning beyond scientific and technical usefulness. It is touched by the divine. The opening words of a well-known poem by the English Jesuit, Jared Manley Hopkins, express this vision inspired by St. Francis. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. Or as he expressed it in another poem, Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his. The image that you see on the program for this conference tries to give a snapshot of this view. Christ in the midst of us all. Such figures as Bonaventure and Scotus in later Franciscan history develop these fundamental insights from the saint himself. And these will be explored, some of them, by my colleague and friend, Dr. Mary Beth Ingham, tomorrow morning. If we wish to focus on this theme of creation, we can say that its purpose is to express outside the Trinitarian communion of persons on the inside. A completely free act of generosity. The community of the Trinity chooses to reveal divine life as a creature. The Word made flesh, the full expression of who God really is, marked by humility, poverty, work, one who heals, who speaks about God's goodness, one who is betrayed, dies, and rises to new life. We see God who is invisible through a creature who is visible, a poor man a carpenter's son. St. Francis will write, "Behold the humility of God." The question at the heart of this innovative vision is a simple one. Where is the center of gravity within our universe? What is the center that demands our attention? Phrased rather sharply, would Christ have come if Adam had not sinned? For most believers, the answer is no. Christ came to atone by his suffering and death for the sin of the first parents described in Genesis. If the sin had not occurred, there would be no need for Christ to come to repair its consequences. In other words, the world might exist without Christ. Contrary to this view, widespread still today, a Franciscan like John Duns Scotus answers the question, would Christ have come anyway, with a firm and enthusiastic, well, yes, of course he would. Christ came because the divine Trinity's purpose in creating was that the center, their heart, the Word, would come as a creature to reveal visibly the otherwise invisible God who is love. With such an adjustment in our point of view, such a re-imaging, we start to look more carefully at the Incarnation and the Nativity, the Feast of the Annunciation and Christmas, and give to them an importance that is often lacking when we focus only on the suffering and the death of Jesus, or including his resurrection, to look at the whole Paschal mystery, just the very end of his life. If we broaden our view, we begin to see all of the life of Christ as healing, saving, as sharing divine life with us from the early moment of his conception through those difficult early days in Bethlehem, in exile, in travel, in work, in preaching. We restore the mystery of the Incarnation to its rightful place. And I think in so doing, we put ourselves back in our rightful place. The great Venetian artist Giovanni Bellini portrays St. Francis in this painting called St. Francis in the Desert, or In a Deserted Place. He stands leaning forward as if about to walk on a mountain dotted with plants and inhabited by animals. A book on a little stand reminds us this is a place of prayer. Francis, the poet and singer, is bathed in a light that comes from a source we cannot see. His eyes look up toward the source of that light, his lips parted as if speaking or singing. A small piece of parchment is tucked under the cord at his waist. We're likely intended to think of the many praises that he wrote out in gratitude to God. Here's a poor man, perfectly at home in God's creation. He fits into this environment. Notice how even the shape of his extended left foot mirrors the lava-like rock formation just behind him. The city of human social life, where he spends much of his time, is just on the horizon. The routine of the daily work of the poor looks up to him by a figure barely visible here of a flock with its shepherd below. There is another presence here, unseen, but suffusing the whole scene with light. Francis is looking at the center of all, the Christ whom we do not see, but who is the reason for all we do see. Our time together is quickly drawing to a close. And I hope that these introductory remarks provide some context for our discussions later on tomorrow during the conference. I just want to summarize what I've said this evening by saying there's still available to us today a Catholic and Christian vision that is more than 800 years old, inspired by the religious experience of Francis of Assisi. It's usually considered a minority view within the broad Catholic tradition of the Latin West, but it seems to have an increasing attraction in today's church and world, in part because of our Pope. His words, the words of Francis the Saint, and the ministry of Pope Francis can be a challenge for us. The two Francises challenge us to reimagine, to renew our image of God, of the human person, of the creation around us. They help us glimpse an image of a church that is poor and for the poor. They invite us to peace building in our local communities and between nations. They inspire us to take responsibility for our common home, its resources, and all its inhabitants. Their shared vision offers us the potential for a fresh look at the human being within an expanding universe, whose center is Christ, the incarnation of God's love. Such a reimagining of the world. This reimagining of the world with Christ as center, marked by new language and new gestures, marks the magisterium of our Pope. I hope these words tonight have helped you understand that vision a little better. May the Lord give you peace.
Thank you again, Bill, for that marvelous overview of the Franciscan vision of Pope Francis. I would suggest that what you just heard from Bill is like a marvelous classical ballet. What you're going to hear from me is going to be much more like a drunken polka. But we're both dancers. Bill began his marvelous overview of the vision of Pope Francis and St. Francis with the words Pope Francis himself used to explain the choice of Francis for his name. You remember this is what he said: Francis of Assisi, for me, he is the man of poverty, the man of peace, the man who loves and protects creation. It seems to me that the challenge that Brother Bill laid out for all of those who are committed to building a better world is that in order to reimagine the world with Pope Francis and St. Francis of Assisi, we must reimagine the work of justice for the poor, of peace as social harmony, and of care for creation, our common home. These are not new themes or projects with the appearance of Pope Francis or even of Francis of Assisi. You find traces of attention to each of these dimensions of the human experience throughout the Jewish and Christian traditions, as well as in the traditions of the great world religions. But the challenge of Pope Francis, as Brother Bill has suggested, is to reimagine this work from the experience of fratelli tutti, that is, from the reality of being brothers and sisters of each other and of creation. Underneath or within the vision of Pope Francis is a vital connection to St. Francis that links them both to the gospel of Jesus Christ and an understanding and experience of salvation that is not determined by the need of sinful humans to make up for what they did wrong, but rather by an experience of salvation that is experienced as encounter, as communion, as presence, as tenderness, and as relationship to Jesus, our brother, the very mercy of God. This is the answer to the question that Bill framed for us, and which is very important, because the answer to that question shapes the world we imagine. We simply cannot do what we cannot imagine, because as human beings, we are built in such a way that we can't do what we can't imagine ourselves doing. The question is this: where is the center of gravity within our universe, the center that demands our attention? That center, as we heard Brother Bill present so beautifully, is the Word, through whom and in whom all things were created, who came into the world as a humble creature to reveal visibly the otherwise invisible God who is love, as Bill put it. Jesus is the incarnation of the mercy of God, whose very coming heals the effects of evil, cruelty, death, and sin. St. Francis expressed this in his own words this way: because Jesus was born for us, we knew we would be saved. The incarnation itself is redemptive. If we want to reimagine the world with Pope Francis and Francis of Assisi, then we must reimagine salvation as an encounter with mercy and not with judgment. Only this way of imagining the world and our relationship with God can reshape our mode of living and relating to others and creations as apostles of this kind of God. Because Jesus was born for us, we can bring a fresh look at the human being and the expanding universe, the place of Christ in the global reality of religious pluralism, and a hope-filled view of a future in which new life is affirmed over the powers of destruction and death, again, as Bill himself described. It is this Franciscan vision that Pope Francis proposes as his vision for a reimagined church. Here is a text from his exhortation, The Joy of the Gospel. Pope Francis says, "The church which goes forth is a community of missionary disciples and takes the first step, who are involved and supportive, who bear fruit and rejoice. The Lord has taken the initiative. He has loved us first, and therefore we can move forward, boldly take the initiative, go out to others, seek those who have fallen away, stand at the crossroads, and welcome the outcast. An evangelizing community gets involved by word and deed in people's daily lives. It bridges distances. It is willing to abase itself if necessary, and it embraces human life, touching the suffering Christ in others. Evangelizers thus take on the smell of the sheep, and the sheep are willing to hear their voice. An evangelizing community is also supportive, standing by people at every step of the way, no matter how difficult or lengthy this may prove to be." And he continues, "The gospel tells us constantly to run the risk of a face-to-face encounter with others, with their physical presence, which challenges us, with their pain and their pleas, with their joy, which infects us in our close and continuous interaction. True faith in the incarnate Son of God is inseparable from self-giving, from membership in the community, from service, from reconciliation with others. The Son of God, by becoming flesh, summoned us to the revolution of tenderness. And finally, the salvation which God offers us is the work of his mercy. The salvation which God has wrought and the church joyfully proclaims is for everyone. God has found a way to unite himself to every human being in every age. He has chosen to call them together as a people and not as isolated individuals. The church must be a place of mercy freely given, where everyone can feel welcomed, loved, forgiven, and encouraged to live the good life of the gospel." Pope Francis reimagines a church that goes forth, that engages in face-to-face encounters, in tenderness and mercy freely given. It is in this description of a reimagined church that Pope Francis reimagines the experience of Francis of Assisi, as well as the theological tradition of the Franciscan movement, as Bill has demonstrated. Going out in personal encounters in tenderness and mercy, this is how the church finds its center of gravity and it reflects the pattern of life that Francis and Clare of Assisi embraced with their brothers and sisters. This is the center of gravity of the universe, is described well by St. Francis, I think, in his own account of his conversion. The story is familiar to you, I'm sure, but his own words are significant. Francis wrote, "When I was in sin, it seemed too bitter for me to see lepers. And the Lord himself led me among them, and I did mercy with them. And when I left them, what had seemed to me was turned into sweetness of body and soul." God led Francis among the lepers to be with them and live with them. Francis insists here that God is the source of his going out among the lepers. To go out is thus the work of God and reflects the going out of God in the Incarnation. Francis goes out to be among the lepers, to be with the lepers in communion and relationship. Francis is not sent to the lepers, but Francis is led simply to be among them, to be with them, just as God's going out in the Incarnation has the purpose of being with what God has created, entering into relationship with it. And finally, as Francis described, God led him among the lepers to do mercy with them, not to do something for them or to give them something, but to experience mercy with them, just as Jesus comes into the world as the presence of God's mercy, to be with us as himself, the compassion of God, so to speak. I think you can see here the connections, the deep connections, between the experience of Francis and Franciscans and the vision of Pope Francis. What is important in Francis of Assisi's description of how he began to live the life according to the gospel, I think, are the prepositions among and with. The prepositions underline relationship and connection, being among and doing with. This is key to reimagining the world. It's all about our relationships with the poor, with creation, and with each other. I read the following words of Pope Francis as a commentary on Francis of Assisi's encounter with lepers. Again, this comes from The Joy of the Gospel. Pope Francis writes, "Sometimes we're tempted to be that kind of Christian who keeps the Lord's wounds at arm's length. Yet Jesus wants us to touch human misery, to touch the suffering of others. He hopes that we will stop looking for those personal or communal niches which shelter us from the maelstrom of human misfortune, and instead enter into the reality of other people's lives and to know there the power of tenderness. When we do so, our lives become wonderfully complicated, and we experience intensely what it is to be a people, to be part of a people. Going out to be among and to be with, a church that goes out to touch the suffering of others, like Francis and the early brothers and sisters who left their comfortable homes and social worlds to discover the center of the universe in an encounter with God become flesh in brothers and sisters, both human and natural. This is the path for reimagining our world. We are so grateful to Brother Bill for opening up this horizon for us in his presentation this evening of the vision of Pope Francis and St. Francis, both of whom begin from the gospel of Jesus and lead us with the experience of brotherhood and sisterhood into the possibility of a world made new in God's image. This vision continues as a source of challenge and inspiration in tomorrow's work of the conference and the presentations of our distinguished speakers, as well as in the ongoing work of the Franciscan School of Theology here at the University of San Diego, who thanks each of you for your presence here this evening. Again, many thanks, Bill, for your marvelous presentation and insights, and may God give us all his peace.